I've been working on my kitchen and I have all of the upper cabinets finished. And what I want to do next is make the doors for these. So the first step is to very carefully measure the openings and write all those down. And from there, I need to break them down further into the size parts that I need to build these doors. And since most of the doors are a different size, you really need to keep track of that so that when you're ready to put them together, you're not short a piece or two. There are a lot of steps involved in changing rough lumber to a finished cabinet door. And the first is to cut the pieces to rough length. And then I can mark on there the individual pieces that I'll be able to rip from it. Of course, building the doors from rough lumber like this is a lot more work, but on the upside, you do save a lot of money because it's considerably cheaper than the dressed lumber you can buy. After I had all the rough parts cut out, I rechecked my numbers to make sure I didn't miss any. Like I said, it's very important to get the right number to begin with. Even though it's possible to do it, of course, you really don't want to be going through all of these finishing steps just to make the one piece that you missed. Next, I can rip them to rough width. And then after I have that done for each individual piece, I'll mark the length on the end. And then when that's done, it's time to count again. I've wheeled out my homemade jointer to get started on finishing these pieces. And the first step is to joint the face. And that generally only takes 2 passes because this wood is not overly crooked. I did that for all the pieces before moving on to the next step. And for that, I need to pull out my thickness planer and set that up. And what I'm doing here is I'm planing this wood down to the final thickness. What I'm shooting for here is about 7/8 of an inch thick, which is a bit thicker than a normal door, but I want something that has a more substantial look. And that's possible when you use rough lumber because it's generally more than 1 inch thick to begin with. And when I have the faces jointed, I can put it up against the fence to joint that edge 90 degrees. With all that done, I can sort them out into groups for the individual doors. And once again, this will show whether I've missed one or not, and it looks like I didn't. And then I can start cutting these to length, and I'm going to do that on my miter saw. I've got a 0 clearance insert that I made for this, and that just slips in. And I can carefully cut these to the exact length they need to be. The longer pieces I just line up with the tape that's here on my miter saw station. But for the shorter pieces where I have more than 2 to cut, I'll take the time to set up my telescoping stop block. Notice that I'm labeling the parts with a number, and that's to avoid mixing them up. With all of the parts prepared, I can move on to assembly, and this is where a lot of people are going to start scratching their head because it doesn't look like this is ready to assemble. Not in the traditional sense anyway. There's no existing joinery for these pieces. Since I'm working with a less than precision table saw, I decided to take a different route for making these and putting them together. And it starts with just gluing the stiles to the rails. And I'm doing that 3 doors at a time, and I cut out these little C-clips from a 2x4 that clamp over the parts and keep them in line with each other while the glue dries. After I got the first one together, I got a little bit more efficient with the process, as expected. When you have a lot of things to put together, you usually get really good at it right before you finish. Because that C-clip that holds the faces in line covers the edge, I really can't see if the parts are lined up properly. So I'm putting a little mark on there across the joint before I put it together, and that'll be visible as I glue it up. Since these frames are just put together with glued butt joints, and that's not especially strong, I want to have some way of reinforcing it. And originally I was going to use dowels in the joints before I put them together. And then I thought about making splines to cut on a table saw, but what I finally settled on was something that is so easy to do. I don't know why I didn't think of it before. Basically what I've done here is I've set my biscuit joiner to maximum depth of cut. And I've actually made these half moon biscuits here, which are long grain and they're maple, just like the door. And I'll get some glue in those slots and glue on the biscuit and slip that in. And that will very effectively strengthen those joints. And I think it looks pretty good as well. And while the glue was drying on the last three, I got started on what I'm calling the reveal trim. And what that is it's just a piece of wood that goes around the inside of the panel, and it has a small reveal cut in it. And once again, I'm making that from the same maple, except this time I'm cutting it from the edge of the stock. What I have on the saddles and rails facing outwards is the typical flat sawn profile or cathedral grain. But these trim pieces will be cut across that, or quarter sawn, I guess you could say. And what that does is it gives a different look to the grain pattern for that trim. It's not a huge difference, but it does distinguish it a little bit. And I think it may be visually interesting. We'll see. Anyway, it took the best part of the full day to cut out all of this trim and get it all dressed smooth on the thickness planer. And then I still have one step left to do, and that's to set up my router table with a rabbeting bit to cut that small reveal. I could have done this on a table saw, but it wouldn't give me as clean a cut as I'll get here on the router table. So all the trim done, I think. In actuality, I did miss one piece, which I had to go through all of that process again, like I talked about before. I wasn't as careful this time checking the parts, but a minor setback because these pieces are not that difficult to make anyway. So the next fun activity is to cut these pieces of trim with miters on the end. And get them put inside the door frames. And to do that, I'm just using pins. I'm not putting any glue on here because I don't want any glue squeeze out towards the face. That would be difficult to clean out. And besides, these trims will be glued in solid when I put the plywood panel in the door. So anyway, I'm using 1 1/4 inch pins through the edge, and I'm using them very sparingly. Only 1 or 2 or maybe at most 3 per piece. And the beauty of these pins is that they don't leave a big hole, so it's very easy to conceal. Most of the time you really don't need to do anything with it because nobody looks that closely at a door. Not normal people anyway. Woodworkers do, but we're not normal. Occasionally though, the nail will do something funny and curl out the front, which is very aggravating. But I've got a reasonable fix for that. I can reach in there with a 1/4 inch chisel and cut through most of that pin and then pull it out with the vice grips. And it does leave a couple of very small holes there, but I can repair those with filler and sand it, and chances are you'll never see that once the doors are finished. So with all of the trim cut and installed in the doors, I'm ready to move on to the next step, which is to cut the plywood panels that will fit in each door. And I'm using 1/2 inch maple plywood for this. And the thickness of the trim that I added when it's flush to the front of the door makes it so that the plywood panel is recessed just slightly at the back. Now I do have to be careful to make sure that the plywood panels are cut as precisely as I can, but if there is a gap, the trim will cover it on the front, of course. The only place you'll actually be able to see it is on the back of the door. With all the plywood panels cut, I can install them. And to do that, I'm just going to squeeze some glue in around the edge. I don't want to put a lot in here because I don't want it to squeeze out on the face. But I still want enough in here that it's going to make a strong bond. And then I could clamp these in place, but I really don't have enough clamps to do that. So once again, I'm going to use pin nails to hold them while the glue dries. Okay, assembly is officially finished. And to get going on the sanding, I'm going to start at the top and bottom of the door where that biscuit spline is. What I did before this was I trimmed off that extra on the miter saw, and then I set up my belt sander on my table saw workbench here just to quickly sand off the end. However, the belt sander is very aggressive and a little bit harder to control because the surface area there is small. So eventually I switched to doing that work by hand with my sanding file. And I'm using the coarse side that has 60 grit paper, and then I'll follow that up with 100 grit on my sanding block. And then I can sand the face frame and the trim with the random orbit sander, and I have a 220 grit disc in here. I already sanded the plywood panel before I put it in. In every kitchen, the thing that you see the most when you walk into the room are the cabinet doors, especially the upper cabinet doors. And you really want to make sure that you do a good sanding job on those. And then I'm going to use my block plane to slightly chamfer the corners and then round those over completely with my sanding block. And it took me most of a full day to do all of the sanding on all 11 doors that I have here. But with that done, the doors are now fully assembled and ready for finish. And in the next video, I'll be spraying these doors with water-based polyurethane, and I'll be installing them in the kitchen, so stick around for that.